The transport ship settled onto the landing pad with a heavy thud that Jake Miller felt through his boots. He grabbed his duffel bag and followed the line of recruits into the Galactic Coalition's main training facility on Station Havara. The place was massive, bigger than anything he'd seen back on Earth, with corridors that stretched out like metallic canyons and ceilings so high they almost disappeared into the artificial lighting above. Jake wasn't nervous, exactly. He'd done his basic training back home in Nevada, survived the desert heat and the drill sergeants who seemed to think sleep was optional. But this was different. This wasn't just humans anymore. This was the real deal, the big leagues where Earth's military would prove whether they belonged among the stars or not. The first thing that hit him was the smell. Not bad, just different. A mix of ozone, recycled air, and something he couldn't quite identify. Probably just the reality of having dozens of alien species all crammed into one facility, each bringing their own biology along for the ride. The second thing that hit him was the noise. The Krolvith made sure of that. They came stomping down the main corridor like they owned the place, which, to be fair, they kind of did. The Krolvith were the Coalition's golden boys, the poster children for military excellence. 7 feet tall on average, covered in thick scales that came in shades of green, purple, and gray, with muscles that looked like they'd been carved from stone. Their footsteps echoed like thunder, and they walked with the kind of confidence that came from generations of being told you were the best. Jake and the other human recruits pressed themselves against the wall to let them pass. It wasn't required, exactly, but it seemed like the smart move. The Krolvith didn't even look at them as they went by, chatting among themselves in their harsh, guttural language that the translators rendered into something vaguely understandable. One of them did look, though. A big one, even by Krolvith standards, with dark purple scales and a chest decorated with what looked like achievement medals from preliminary training. His eyes locked onto Jake for just a moment, and something passed between them. Recognition, maybe. The kind of look a predator gives when it spots something that might be fun to chase. The Krolvith's name tag read Drax. Sergeant Drax. One rank above Jake's private status, which meant he had authority to back up whatever attitude he decided to bring. Great, Jake thought. Just great. The human contingent got assigned to barracks in the lower levels, which everyone knew meant they were at the bottom of the food chain. The room was clean and functional, with bunks that adjusted to accommodate different species' needs. Jake's bunkmate turned out to be a guy named Tommy from Texas, who spent the first 10 minutes complaining about how the artificial gravity felt wrong and the air tasted recycled. Their commanding officer for orientation was a Velnair, one of the aquatic species that needed moisture suits to survive outside water. Commander Veltar had been with the Coalition for 30 years, according to the information packet, and had the kind of tired eyes that suggested he'd seen every possible type of recruit drama at least twice. The commander's speech was standard stuff. Work hard, respect your fellow soldiers, remember that you represent your entire species. Jake had heard variations of it 100 times. What caught his attention was the unspoken message underneath all the official words. The way Veltar's eyes lingered on the human group a bit longer than the others. The subtle emphasis on certain words like prove yourselves and earn your place. They were on trial here. Everyone knew it. Earth had only joined the Coalition 5 years ago, and humans were still the new kids trying to figure out where they fit in the galactic hierarchy. Every other species had centuries or millennia of spacefaring history. Humans had barely made it past their own moon before first contact. The first real interaction with other species came during equipment checkout. Jake stood in line behind a Chitix, one of the insectoid species with 4 arms and compound eyes that never seemed to blink. Ahead of them, the Krolvith were taking their sweet time, joking with the supply officer and making a show of inspecting every piece of gear like they were shopping for luxury items. When Jake's turn finally came, he kept his head down and his responses short. Yes sir, no sir, thank you sir. Basic military courtesy that worked regardless of species. He was almost clear when he felt a heavy hand on his shoulder, spinning him around. Drax stood there, looking down at Jake with an expression that might have been a smile if you ignored the rows of sharp teeth. Watch where you're walking, soft skin, the Krolvith said, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. The translator caught every nuance of contempt in that nickname. Jake hadn't been walking anywhere. He'd been standing still. But he recognized the play. This was the opening move, the test to see how the human would react. Push back too hard and you're a troublemaker. Do nothing and you become the designated victim. Jake met Drax's eyes for exactly 2 seconds, then looked away. Not down, just away. Acknowledging the confrontation without escalating it. My mistake, Sergeant, he said quietly. Drax's companions laughed, that grinding rock sound that Krolvith made when they were amused. The sergeant gave Jake's shoulder a squeeze that was just slightly too hard before letting go. "Better watch yourself, human. Wouldn't want you to get hurt your first day." As Jake walked away with his equipment, Tommy fell into step beside him. "Man, that guy's gonna be a problem, isn't he?" Jake adjusted his grip on the duffel bag, already feeling where Drax's fingers had dug into his shoulder. "Yeah," he said. "Probably." What he didn't say was that he'd dealt with guys like Drax before. Different species, same attitude. The universe, apparently, was full of bullies who measured their worth by how much they could push others around. The thing about bullies, though, was that they were predictable. They always followed the same pattern. Push, push, push until something pushed back. Jake had grown up in South Boston, where being small meant learning to fight smart or not surviving middle school. He'd learned patience there, and timing, and the importance of choosing your moments carefully. The Krolvith might have scales and size, but humans had something else. They had 10,000 years of learning how to take down things bigger and meaner than themselves. That night, lying in his bunk while Tommy snored below him, Jake stared at the ceiling and thought about the weeks ahead. Training would be brutal. The Krolvith would make sure of that. But he'd endure it. He'd watch and learn and wait. Because sooner or later, Drax would push too far. And when that happened, Jake would be ready. The harassment started small, which was how these things always began. Jake noticed it on the second day during morning formation. Drax would position himself just close enough that his elbow would catch Jake's ribs when they turned. Nothing major, nothing you could officially complain about. Just enough to let Jake know he was being watched, being tested. By the end of the first week, it escalated. Jake's boots went missing from his locker. He found them later, covered in some kind of caustic cleaning solution that ate through the leather. When he reported it to the supply officer, the Krolvith on duty just shrugged and told him to be more careful with his equipment. The replacement came out of Jake's pay. Tommy tried to stick up for him once during a training drill. Drax had deliberately stepped on Jake's rifle during inspection, grinding it into the dirt with his massive boot. Tommy opened his mouth to protest, and Drax's eyes swung toward him with such cold intensity that the words died in his throat. After that, Tommy kept his distance. Jake didn't blame him. Survival instinct was survival instinct, regardless of species. The other aliens watched it all with varying degrees of interest. The Chittics seemed uncomfortable with the whole situation, their antennae twitching nervously whenever Drax went after Jake. The crystalline lumens, beings of living light and mineral, appeared completely indifferent to mammalian social dynamics. And the other Krolvith just followed their sergeant's lead, because that's what soldiers did. What bothered Jake most wasn't the physical stuff. He'd taken hits before, could handle a few bruises and some missing gear. What got under his skin was the constant commentary. Drax had a gift for timing his insults just right, always when instructors were out of earshot or distracted. Comments about human weakness, about how Earth soldiers were only useful for pushing buttons on machines because they couldn't handle real combat. The worst part was that some of it landed. Because humans were weaker, at least in terms of raw physical strength. A Krolvith could bench press 3 times what Jake could on his best day. Their scales provided natural armor that could stop blades and deflect small-caliber rounds. They healed faster, hit harder, and could survive in environments that would kill a human in minutes. But strength wasn't everything. Jake kept telling himself that, even as Drax's daily torment ground away at his patience. 2 weeks in, they had their first major team exercise. Mixed species squads running a combat simulation in the station's training grounds, which were set up to mimic hostile territory. Jake's squad included Tommy, 2 Chittics named something unpronounceable that they shortened to Click and Clack, and a Lumen who communicated by flashing different colors. Drax's squad was supposed to provide covering fire from an elevated position while Jake's team moved through the target zone. Simple coordination exercise, the kind they'd run 100 times in different configurations. Except when Jake's squad entered the kill box, Drax's team went silent. The simulation rounds hit hard, not enough to cause real damage but enough to hurt like hell and register as kills on their armor sensors. Jake took 3 hits before he could scramble behind cover, his entire left side lighting up red on the display. Tommy got clipped trying to drag him back. The Chittics made it to cover, but their armor showed multiple hits. When Jake looked up at Drax's position, he could see the Krolvith watching through his scope, doing absolutely nothing. The simulation ended with Jake's entire squad marked as casualties. The after-action review was brutal. Instructor Veltar, the Velnair commander, pulled up the tactical display and pointed out every mistake, every wrong decision, every moment of poor communication. He saved the worst for last, highlighting the 30-second window where Drax's squad had clear shots and hadn't taken them. Drax's excuse was smooth as silk. Equipment malfunction. Communication disruption. Couldn't get a clear line of sight. All lies, all delivered with the practiced ease of someone who knew exactly how to work the system. The instructor's eyes narrowed, but without proof of deliberate sabotage, there was nothing he could do. He assigned additional training to both squads and dismissed them. Jake found Drax outside the simulation center, surrounded by his crew. The Krolvith was laughing about something, probably replaying their performance for entertainment. Jake walked straight up to him, his simulated wounds still aching across his ribs and shoulder. "We need to talk," Jake said. His voice was level, controlled, but something in it made Drax's companions stop laughing. Drax turned slowly, looking down at Jake with exaggerated amusement. "About what, soft skin? About how your pathetic squad couldn't complete a basic exercise. How you got your whole team killed because humans don't belong in real combat. You left us hanging on purpose," Jake said. "You had clear shots and you held fire. Prove it." Drax leaned down, bringing his scaled face close to Jake's. His breath smelled like sulfur and meat. "You want to file a complaint, human? Go ahead. Tell the commander that the big bad Krolvith was mean to you. Everyone here already knows what your species really is. Cowards hiding behind technology. Without your guns and ships, you're nothing but prey animals that got lucky." Something cold settled into Jake's chest. It wasn't anger, exactly. More like clarity. He'd been holding on to the hope that this could be resolved through proper channels, that the system would work if he just followed the rules and kept his head down. But Drax had just showed him the truth. The system wasn't built for humans yet. They were too new, too unproven, too easy to dismiss. "You're right," Jake said quietly. "We're not as strong as Krolvith. We don't have scales or claws or any natural advantages." Drax grinned, thinking he'd won. Finally, the monkey admits it. "But we survived anyway," Jake continued. "We climbed to the top of our food chain without any of that stuff. You know how we did it? We learned to hunt smarter. We learned patience. We learned to wait for exactly the right moment." Drax's grin faltered slightly, not sure where this was going. "And we learned something else," Jake said, meeting the alien's eyes without flinching. "We learned that the biggest predator isn't always the most dangerous one." For a moment, something like understanding passed between them. Drax's expression shifted, no longer quite so confident. Then he shoved Jake backward, hard enough to send him stumbling. "Get out of my sight before I decide to teach you some real lessons, human." Jake caught himself against the wall, his shoulder screaming in protest. He looked at Drax, at the Krolvith's companions forming a loose semicircle, at the few other recruits who'd stopped to watch the confrontation. Then he turned and walked away, his back straight despite the pain. That night, lying in his bunk again, Jake made his decision. He couldn't report this. Any complaint would be his word against a Krolvith sergeant's, and everyone knew how that would play out. He couldn't transfer out, because that would confirm every stereotype about humans being weak and unsuited for military service. And he couldn't keep taking this abuse for another 6 months of training, because eventually Drax would push far enough that someone would get seriously hurt. There was only one option left. Wait for Drax to make a mistake. Wait for him to cross the line in a way that couldn't be ignored or explained away. And when that moment came, respond in a way that would make every alien in this facility understand one simple truth about humans. They might be small. They might be soft. But they were survivors who'd learned to fight dirty, fight smart, and never give up. Jake didn't have to wait long. The moment would come tomorrow, during hand-to-hand combat demonstrations. And when it did, the entire coalition was going to learn why you never mistake human patience for human weakness. The combat demonstration hall was packed. Every recruit on Station Havara had to pass through hand-to-hand combat certification, and today was evaluation day for Jake's training group. The space was enormous, with padded floors and observation platforms where instructors could watch from multiple angles. Cameras mounted on the walls captured everything for review and training purposes. Jake stood in line with the other humans, watching the Krolvith go through their demonstrations first. They were impressive, no question about it. Their sparring matches looked more like controlled demolitions, with bodies slamming into mats hard enough to make the floor shake. The instructors nodded approvingly, marking scores on their tablets while the Krolvith preened under the attention. When Drax's turn came, he put on a show. His opponent was another Krolvith, nearly as big as he was, and they went at each other with the kind of intensity that made the other species watching take a step back. Grappling, striking, using their natural advantages of size and strength. Drax won, of course. He always won. And when he did, he made sure to look directly at Jake while the instructors praised his technique. Then it was the humans' turn. Tommy went first, managing a respectable performance against one of the Chitics. The insectoid's 4 arms gave it an advantage, but Tommy adapted well, using speed and unpredictability to compensate. The instructors seemed pleasantly surprised. Maybe these humans weren't completely useless after all. Jake was called up next. His opponent was another human, a guy named Ryan from California who had about 20 pounds on him. They squared up, touched fists, and went through the drill. It wasn't exciting or particularly impressive. Just solid, basic technique. Blocks, strikes, a takedown, a reversal. Enough to pass the evaluation without standing out. The instructors marked their scores. Adequate. Satisfactory. Moving on. Jake heard Drax's laugh from across the hall, that grinding rock sound that set his teeth on edge. The Krolvith was whispering to his companions, loud enough that the words carried. Something about humans looking pathetic even when fighting each other. More laughter followed. The demonstrations wrapped up around midday. The instructors dismissed everyone to the mess hall for lunch, reminding them that afternoon sessions would cover tactical planning. The crowd began filtering out through the main corridor, a mix of species all heading the same direction, talking about the morning's performances. Jake walked with Tommy, trying to ignore the ache in his muscles from the sparring. The corridor was wide enough for 4 or 5 people to walk side by side, with that same metallic smell and artificial lighting that characterized every part of the station. Other recruits streamed past, some chattering excitedly, others quiet and focused. That's when he heard the heavy footsteps behind him. Jake didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The particular rhythm of those steps, the way other recruits instinctively moved aside, the sound of Krolvith voices speaking in that harsh, guttural language. "Hey, soft skin," Drax's voice cut through the corridor noise. That was some impressive fighting back there. Jake kept walking. "Don't engage. Don't give him the satisfaction. I'm talking to you, human." The footsteps got closer. Tommy glanced at Jake nervously, but Jake just shook his head slightly. "Keep moving." Almost to the mess hall. Just a few more minutes. Then Drax's fist slammed into Jake's shoulder from behind. It wasn't a tap or a playful shove. It was a full punch, delivered with enough force to send Jake stumbling forward into the wall. Pain exploded across his shoulder blade and down his arm. His hand hit the metal wall to catch himself, fingers scraping against the cold surface. The corridor went silent. Conversations died mid-sentence. Footsteps stopped. Everyone within 20 feet turned to watch. Jake pushed himself away from the wall and turned slowly. His left arm hung at his side, throbbing with pain that radiated all the way down to his fingertips. He could feel the bruise already forming, deep in the muscle. Later, he'd find out the punch had actually cracked the bone. But right now, all he felt was the pain and something else underneath it. Something cold and calculating that had been building for 2 weeks. Drax stood there grinning, his purple scales catching the overhead lights. His companions flanked him, forming that familiar semicircle. The Krolvith's posture screamed dominance, from the way he held his shoulders to the tilt of his head. This was his moment, his chance to cement the hierarchy in front of witnesses. "Just a joke, soft skin," Drax said loudly, playing to the crowd. "Can't you humans take a joke?" Several aliens laughed nervously. A few looked uncomfortable. The Chitics clicked their mandibles in distress. But nobody intervened. This was how things worked in the coalition military. Species established their pecking order, and you either adapted or you washed out. Jake looked at Drax's face. At the rows of sharp teeth showing in that predator's grin. At the sergeant's insignia on his uniform. At the medals from preliminary training that decorated his chest. He looked at the crowd watching, waiting to see if the human would break or bend or simply walk away. Then Jake smiled. It wasn't a big smile. Nothing dramatic or theatrical. Just a small, quiet expression that somehow changed the entire atmosphere in the corridor. Tommy would later describe it as the scariest thing he'd ever seen. Not angry or aggressive. Just calm. The kind of calm that came before something inevitable. "Sure," Jake said, his voice steady despite the pain screaming through his shoulder. "I can take a joke." He paused, and that small smile never wavered. "Can you?" Drax's grin faltered for just a fraction of a second. Something in Jake's tone, or maybe in his eyes, triggered an instinct buried deep in the Krolvith's brain. The recognition that he might have made a mistake. That he might have pushed something that shouldn't have been pushed. But Drax was committed now, in front of his crew and half the station's recruits. He couldn't back down. So he did what bullies always do when they feel uncertain. He escalated. Tough talk from a. Drax reached out to shove Jake again, his massive hand aiming for the human's chest. The final humiliation before walking away victorious. Jake moved. The first thing he did was step forward, not back. It was counterintuitive, the opposite of what prey animals did when threatened. But it brought him inside Drax's reach, close enough that those long Krolvith arms became a disadvantage instead of an advantage. Close enough that size and strength mattered less than speed and precision. The second thing Jake did was strike Drax's solar plexus with his palm. Not a punch, not yet. A precise, targeted hit that compressed the nerve cluster located just below the Krolvith's sternum. It was a spot humans had been exploiting for thousands of years in martial arts, pressure point fighting that worked regardless of whether your opponent was human or alien, as long as they had a centralized nervous system. Drax's breath exploded outward in a whoosh of air. His eyes went wide with shock. His arms, still reaching for Jake, dropped reflexively as his body betrayed him. Every instinct he had screamed at his lungs to breathe, to process what had just happened, leaving him completely open. The third thing Jake did decided everything. He pivoted slightly, rotating his hips to generate power from his legs and core rather than just his arms. Then he threw an uppercut that traveled maybe 8 inches from start to finish. Short, economical, perfect. Every ounce of technique he'd learned growing up in South Boston, every hour spent in the gym training, every bit of frustration from 2 weeks of harassment, all compressed into one moment of absolute precision. Jake's fist connected with Drax's jaw with a crack that echoed through the corridor like a gunshot. One of Drax's teeth, a prominent fang that the Krolvith used for display and intimidation, snapped clean off. It spun through the air in what seemed like slow motion, catching the overhead lights as it tumbled end over end before clattering across the metal floor. Drax's head snapped back. His legs, suddenly unable to support his massive weight, buckled. He fell backward like a demolished building, hitting the floor with a thud that shook the corridor. His eyes rolled up, showing white. Unconscious before his skull bounced off the padded floor mat. The entire exchange, from Drax reaching out to Drax hitting the ground, took less than 3 seconds. The silence in the corridor lasted maybe 5 seconds. Then everything exploded into chaos. Drax's companions rushed forward, not to attack Jake but to check on their fallen sergeant. The Chittics started clicking frantically, their translator unit struggling to keep up. Someone shouted for medical assistance. Tommy grabbed Jake's good arm and pulled him back, putting distance between them and the unconscious Krolvith. Jake didn't resist. He stood there, shaking out his right hand and wincing at the pain shooting through his knuckles. His hand was already swelling, the skin across his first 2 knuckles split and bleeding. Worth it, he thought distantly. Totally worth it. Security arrived within 2 minutes. 4 officers, 2 Krolvith and 2 from a species Jake didn't recognize, with equipment that looked like it could stun an elephant. But when they saw the scene, saw Jake standing calmly with his hands already moving behind his head in the universal position of surrender, they seemed almost confused about what to do. One of the Krolvith security officers approached Jake carefully. "Private Miller, you need to come with us." "Yes sir," Jake said. No argument, no resistance. He'd known this was coming the moment he threw that punch. As they led him away, Jake caught glimpses of the crowd that had gathered. Dozens of recruits from multiple species, all staring at him with expressions ranging from shock to something that might have been respect. Tommy gave him a small nod, which was more support than Jake had expected. Even some of the other Krolvith looked at him differently now, not with contempt but with a kind of wary acknowledgement. They put Jake in a holding room, not quite a cell but close enough. White walls, a metal bench, a camera in the corner recording everything. A medical officer came by to examine his hand, wrapping it in something that felt cool and made the swelling go down. She didn't speak to him, just did her job and left. Hours passed. Jake sat on the bench and played the whole thing over in his mind. The punch, the sound of Drax's tooth hitting the floor, the look on everyone's faces. He tried to feel regret but couldn't quite manage it. Maybe that made him a bad soldier. Maybe it made him exactly the kind of soldier Earth needed out here. They came for him at dawn the next morning. A formal escort that walked him through empty corridors to the station's administrative section. The hearing room was smaller than Jake expected, more like a conference room than a courtroom. A long table at the front where 3 officers sat today. Chairs arranged in rows for witnesses. Cameras in every corner. Commander Veltar sat in the center position, his moisture suit gleaming under the lights. To his left was a Krolvath officer with grey scales and enough medals to suggest serious combat experience. To his right sat someone from a species Jake had never seen before, almost humanoid but with crystalline features that refracted light in strange ways. Drax sat off to one side, his jaw wired shut with some kind of medical device. His face was swollen, mottled with bruises that showed dark against his purple scales. He wouldn't look at Jake, keeping his eyes fixed on the floor. The hearing began with the presentation of evidence. They played the security footage first, multiple angles showing the entire incident in crystal clear detail. Drax approaching Jake from behind. The punch that sent Jake into the wall. Jake turning around. The confrontation. Then those 3 seconds that had everyone leaning forward in their seats. They showed it once at normal speed. Then again in slow motion, breaking down every movement. Jake stepped forward. The palm strike. The uppercut. The tooth flying free. Drax collapsing like someone had cut his strings. Even in slow motion, even knowing what was coming, it was brutal and efficient. The medical report came next. Drax had a fractured jaw, severe concussion, and trauma to his nervous system from the solar plexus strike. Recovery time estimated at 6 weeks. Then they showed Jake's injuries, comparatively minor. Cracked bone in his shoulder from Drax's initial punch, bruised knuckles, some scraped skin. Then came the part Jake hadn't expected. Commander Veltar pulled up additional footage, recordings that went back 2 full weeks. Every incident of Drax's harassment, all documented by the station's surveillance system. The destroyed boots. The shoves during formation. The deliberate abandonment during the combat simulation. Every whispered insult, every act of sabotage, all laid out in chronological order. Jake felt something loosen in his chest. They'd been watching. They'd known the whole time what was happening. Veltar's voice filled the room, translated into multiple languages simultaneously. Sergeant Drax, you have systematically violated the Coalition's codes of conduct regarding treatment of fellow soldiers. You deliberately sabotaged equipment belonging to Private Miller. You endangered his entire squad during combat exercises by withholding necessary support. And yesterday, you physically assaulted a subordinate soldier in a manner that, by your own species standards, constitutes an invitation to honorable combat. Drax tried to speak through his wired jaw, but only managed muffled sounds. Veltar held up a hand for silence. Your actions have brought dishonor not only to yourself but to your species' proud military tradition. The Krolvath we have known are warriors of honor who respect strength in all its forms. You have shown neither honor nor respect. Therefore, your rank is hereby stripped. You are reduced to the status of private and will repeat your entire training cycle under remedial observation. Perhaps you will learn what Private Miller already understands, that true strength is measured not by size or natural advantages, but by character and discipline. A ripple went through the observers. Stripping rank was serious, especially for a Krolvath. It was public humiliation, the kind of punishment that would follow Drax for his entire career. Then Veltar turned to Jake, and for a moment Jake's heart sank. Here it comes, he thought. Court-martial, discharge, the end of his military career before it really started. Private Miller, the commander said, and his tone was different now. Almost thoughtful. You demonstrated remarkable restraint over a 2-week period of sustained harassment. Your conduct during that time was exemplary. However, your response yesterday, while effective, violated established protocols for resolving conflicts through proper channels. Jake kept his face neutral, waiting for the hammer to fall. You are hereby sentenced to 30 days of additional duty, Veltar continued. Specifically, you will serve as an assistant combat instructor, where you will teach hand-to-hand combat techniques to recruits from all species, including Krolvath. You will demonstrate the methods you employed yesterday, breaking down the mechanics and principles for educational purposes. Jake blinked. Sir, I don't understand. That's not a punishment. Something that might have been a smile crossed Veltar's aquatic features. No, Private Miller, it is not. Consider it instead an observation and an opportunity. The Coalition military has operated for centuries using training methods developed primarily by species with significant physical advantages. The Krolvath, the Thorians, others like them. We assumed their natural strength made them superior combatants. The commander leaned forward slightly. Your actions yesterday suggest we may have been overlooking something crucial. Humans evolved without claws, without scales, without natural weapons of any kind. Yet you dominated your planet's ecosystem. You became apex predators through intelligence, strategy, and technique. These are lessons that every Coalition soldier could benefit from learning. The Krolvith officer beside Veltar spoke up, his voice rough but clear. I have fought beside many species in my career. The most dangerous opponents are rarely the strongest. They are the ones who think, who adapt, who turn disadvantages into advantages. This human demonstrated that principle perfectly. He should teach others. Jake found his voice finally. I'll do my best, sir. See that you do, Veltar said. Dismissed. As Jake left the hearing room, he passed Drax in the corridor. The former sergeant still wouldn't meet his eyes, but Jake caught a glimpse of something in his expression. Not quite respect, not yet. But maybe understanding. Maybe the beginning of it. Word spread through Station Havara faster than Jake expected. By the time he returned to the barracks that afternoon, recruits from half a dozen species had found excuses to walk past him in the corridors. Some nodded respectfully. Others just stared. A few Krolvith looked at him with barely concealed hostility, but even they kept their distance. Tommy greeted him with a grin that threatened to split his face. Dude, you're like a legend now. People are calling you the giant killer. The humans in Beta Company want to buy you drinks. The Chitiks are composing songs about you or something. Jake flexed his bandaged hand carefully. I just punched a guy, Tommy. It's not that big a deal. Not that big a deal? Jake, you knocked out a Krolvith sergeant in 3 seconds. Nobody does that. Especially not humans. Tommy lowered his voice. You know what this means, right? Every human on this station just got a little more respect because of what you did. We're not just the soft newcomers anymore. That thought sat heavy in Jake's chest. He hadn't been thinking about representing humanity when he threw that punch. He'd just been tired of being pushed around. But Tommy was right. Like it or not, his actions reflected on every human in the coalition military. The weight of that responsibility felt heavier than Drax's punch had. His first teaching assignment came 3 days later. Jake walked into the combat training hall and found it packed. Way more recruits than he'd expected, representing at least 10 different species. Some were there because it was mandatory. Others had clearly come just to see if the stories were true. Standing near the back, arms crossed and expression neutral, was Drax. The wires had been removed from his jaw, though the bruising still showed dark against his scales. Their eyes met for a moment, and Jake saw something complicated there. Not quite forgiveness, not quite friendship, but maybe a grudging acknowledgement. The senior instructor, a massive Krolvith named Commander Throk with grey scales and scars that told stories of actual combat, addressed the assembled recruits. Many of you have heard about the incident that occurred last week. Some of you witnessed it. Today, Private Miller will demonstrate the techniques he used, and more importantly, explain the principles behind them. I suggest you pay attention. Strength is valuable, but as you are about to learn, it is not the only path to victory. Jake stepped forward, feeling every eye in the room locked onto him. Public speaking had never been his strength, but the military had taught him to fake confidence when necessary. Okay, so first thing you need to understand is that humans evolved differently than most species here. We didn't have natural weapons. No claws, no fangs worth mentioning, no armored skin. We were actually pretty terrible at fighting, physically speaking. A few chuckles rippled through the crowd. Jake continued. But we survived anyway. We became the dominant species on our planet. You know how? We learned to think our way through problems. We learned to use tools, strategy, and technique to overcome opponents that were bigger and stronger. He gestured to Tommy, who'd volunteered to be his demonstration partner. The first principle is distance management. Most strong fighters want to use their reach advantage, keep you at the end of their longer arms where their power is greatest. So you do the opposite. You get close, inside their reach, where size becomes a disadvantage. Jake demonstrated, stepping inside Tommy's extended arm. See how his arm can't generate much power now? The biomechanics don't work at this range. This is where technique beats strength. He moved through the sequence slowly, explaining each element. The importance of targeting vulnerable spots that every species shared, nerve clusters, joints, the solar plexus. How to generate power from your entire body rather than just your arms. The value of economy of motion, making every movement count. The recruits watched intently. Even the Krolvith, who'd probably assumed they had nothing to learn from a human, leaned forward to catch the details. The second principle is timing, Jake continued. In that corridor, Drax was committed to his action. He'd reached out, his weight was moving forward. That's when you strike, when your opponent has already decided what they're doing and can't easily change course. You don't fight their strength. You use their momentum against them. He demonstrated again, having Tommy reach for him and then showing how to redirect that energy. It's like falling backwards. Once you start, you can't just stop halfway. That split second of commitment is your opening. A Chitix raised one of its forearms. But what about species with natural advantages? Our exoskeletons, Krolvath scales, Thorian regeneration? Doesn't biology still matter? Of course it matters, Jake acknowledged. I'm not saying technique beats everything. A bad fighter with natural advantages will lose to a good fighter with technique. But a good fighter with natural advantages? That's almost unbeatable. That's why you're all here, to become good fighters regardless of what biology gave you. The training session ran for 3 hours. Jake demonstrated dozens of techniques, answered questions, and watched as recruits from different species tried to apply the principles. Some picked it up quickly. Others struggled. But everyone paid attention in a way that Jake suspected they hadn't for regular combat instruction. Toward the end, Commander Throck called Jake over. The massive Krolvath looked down at him with an expression that was difficult to read. You did well today, Private. Better than I expected. Thank you, sir. I want to tell you something, Throck said quietly, so only Jake could hear. I have been an instructor here for 12 years. I have seen hundreds of recruits pass through these halls. Many were strong. Many were fast. But very few understood what you demonstrated today. Combat is not about being the biggest or having the hardest scales. It is about will, intelligence, and the refusal to give up even when facing impossible odds. The commander glanced at Drax, who was practicing the techniques with surprising focus. That one learned an important lesson. Pride is useful, but arrogance is deadly. He will be a better soldier for this experience, though it was a hard lesson to swallow. Over the following weeks, Jake's role expanded beyond just teaching. Commanders from other training groups requested his presence for demonstrations. He began consulting on hand-to-hand combat curriculum updates. Other humans on the station started developing their own teaching methods, sharing techniques from various martial arts traditions back on Earth. The change wasn't just in how others saw humans. It was in how humans saw themselves. They walked with more confidence now. They didn't automatically defer to bigger species. They'd learned that size wasn't everything, that intelligence and technique could level any playing field. Drax completed his remedial training 4 months later. To everyone's surprise, he sought Jake out in the combat hall afterward. The former sergeant looked different now, humbler somehow, the arrogance that had defined him worn away by hard lessons. Private Miller, he said formally. I wanted to speak with you before I receive my new assignment. Jake set down the equipment he'd been organizing. What's on your mind? I owe you an apology, Drax said, the words clearly difficult for him. My behavior was dishonorable. I saw you as weak because of your size, and I used my strength to bully you. I did not understand that strength comes in many forms. He paused, seeming to search for the right words. Among my people, when a warrior bests you in combat, they have earned the right to your respect. You bested me completely. More than that, you showed mercy by teaching rather than gloating. This is true strength. Jake extended his hand, human style. After a moment's hesitation, Drax took it carefully, mindful of his grip. We're good, Jake said simply. Just don't punch anyone else as a joke, yeah? Something that might have been a smile crossed the Krolvath's face. Agreed. A year later, Jake stood in the same combat hall, but this time wearing corporal stripes on his uniform. His class had graduated, with honors. Drax had been reassigned to an active combat unit, where early reports suggested he was performing well and treating subordinates with respect. The new batch of recruits filed in for their first day of training. Jake recognized the mix of species, saw the same dynamics starting to form, the bigger ones sizing up the smaller ones. He spotted a human private near the back, looking nervous. Jake stepped forward to address the group. Welcome to hand-to-hand combat training. I'm Corporal Miller, and I'm going to teach you something important. The most dangerous predator isn't always the biggest or the strongest. Sometimes it's the one that learned to hunt with its brain instead of its muscles. He paused, letting that sink in. If you're big and strong, that's great. Use it. But don't ever assume that size alone makes you superior. And if you're small, if you don't have natural weapons or armor, don't assume that makes you weak. Some of the most successful predators in Earth's history were smaller than their prey. They succeeded through intelligence, teamwork, and absolute refusal to quit. He walked to the center of the mat. On Earth, we have a saying, it's not the size of the dog in the fight, it's the size of the fight in the dog. For the next few months, I'm going to teach you how to be the scrappiest, smartest, most unpredictable fighter in the coalition. Species doesn't matter. Size doesn't matter. What matters is how you think, how you adapt, and whether you're willing to push past your limits. Jake looked at each recruit in turn. And if anyone here thinks they can bully their way through this program, let me tell you what happens. You'll lose a tooth, you'll lose your rank, and you'll learn the hard way that respect isn't taken by force. It's earned through honor. In the back row, the nervous human private stood a little straighter. The lesson had been learned. And it would be passed on.